didn't grow facial hair. All this is a product of intermixing with white people from the caves, and now we got hair everywhere. But the original people, we didn't have hair everywhere like this. We were the builders of civilization, but we start mixing with Captain Caveman and them.
So that deluded black supremacist American is called Nuri Mohammed, and he's a member of Nation of Islam. So these guys believe that Arabs and Jews are both white imposters, and both of these groups were actually black. Here you see his website, and he's actually a student minister of Louis Farrakhan and serves in a mosque. And something I didn't know that's a little disconcerting here is that these mosques actually have schools and daycare facilities. So basically black supremacists who openly rant about white people being these evil genetic mutations and innately inferior and everything are allowed by our government to operate schools. So groups like Nation of Islam are subsets of the Afrocentric movement. They call Afrocentrism a scholarly movement, and of course they don't mention anything about it being supremacist or anything. But in reality, it's black supremacy mixed with this sort of acutely dishonest black historical revisionism. In general, American blacks seem to be the ones most vulnerable to this train of thought. There are several different Afrocentric black supremacist groups besides the already discussed Nation of Islam. There are the Black Hebrew Israelites who believe Black Americans, Native Americans, and Latin Americans are all descendants of the ancient Israelites. Then we have the Moorish Science Temple of America, who are another supremacist black Muslim sect, and they call themselves Moors and claim that black Americans are the descendants of the Moors from what they refer to as a Moroccan Empire. Look at these kooks here. The Black Egyptian hypothesis, which has been adopted by most black supremacist groups, claims that the ancient Egyptians were of sub-Saharan African descent, and this hypothesis has inspired the Kemet and Hotep movements, and has also been adopted by Rastafarians, who also think that the last reigning Ethiopian emperor, Haile Selassie, was God incarnate. The Solomonic dynasty, which Selassie belonged to, also claimed descendants from the tribe of Judah through King Solomon, which is why the emperor's hereditary title is the Lion of Judah, and there are stars of David on his imperial flag. Then there is the Afrocentric claim that the Olmec were black, which was first suggested by anthropologist Leo Wiener, and popularized in the American black community by pseudo-archaeologist and historian Ivan van Sertima. And so there's this deep-seated need for blacks, and especially New World blacks, to appropriate admirable ancient cultures and revise history. It's really much more rampant and popular than people would imagine, and it's always seemingly interwoven with these black supremacist claims that whites are genetically inferior, subhuman, albinos, and that blacks are the only true humans in the world. It's the whole we was Kangs and you was albino cave beasts narrative. If you Google search any ancient civilization followed by the words was black, you'll almost certainly find this psychopath's website. He's strung together hundreds of pages on this primitive and desperate website and basically thinks that every single major civilization on Earth was at one time black, and every traditional narrative is a white plot to revise history and conceal black greatness. This is the sort of projection used by many with acute inferiority complexes, as a superiority complex is really just a neurotic defense mechanism used by those with true feelings of inferiority. What you'll generally see these types of charlatans do is use the interpretations of art or the cherry picked testimony of ancient scholars to try to prove their racial theories. And to be fair, there are some whites who do this exact same thing to try to prove that all of the ancient civilizations were somehow white or Caucasian or Aryan. It's always somewhat cringeworthy for me to see whites doing this, so I'd always encourage my subscribers to at least treat such interpretations with some degree of skepticism. In a way, it's rather depressing and heartbreaking these descendants of former slaves who came from arguably the least successful race in human history need to delude themselves in such a way just to keep themselves from feeling inferior. But one quickly loses sympathy when you realize that these feelings of inferiority lead them to resentment and jealousy and hatred of objectively more successful groups, which is why they hate whites so much and try to frame us as subhuman as a result. The views of Francis Cress Welsing really kind of exemplify Afrocentric mentalities, which again are actually quite common among American blacks, especially those in the Black Power movement. Quote, "The collectivity of whites has evolved patterns of societal structuring to cause blacks and other people of color to appear functionally inferior to themselves through both crude and highly refined methodologies, to deprive peoples of color of the same social, economic, educational, and political supports that they provide for themselves. They then say that such patterns of inferior functioning are genetically determined. Dr. William Shockley and all others who cannot cease talking and writing in a negative manner about the genetics of black people and other people of color, whether the discussion be overt or covert, are all simply victims not only of the genetic recessive deficiency state of skin albinism, but also its component psychological disease state of racism, white supremacy." Unquote. So not only do people like Welsing believe that whites are a genetic defect, but they also think that the comorbidity of our genetic inferiority is racism or white supremacy. Welsing published a book called The ISIS Papers, The Keys to the Colors, and again there is this ancient Egyptian obsession where she described white people as the genetically defective descendants of albino mutants. And she wrote that due to this defective mutation, they may have been forcibly expelled from Africa. Oh no, don't kick me out of Africa. It's also rather ironic that Francis Welsing was calling Dr. William Shockley a subhuman supremacist, basically, given that Francis Welsing was just a lunatic race theorist of mediocre intelligence, while Dr. William Shockley was a brilliant professor of electrical engineering at Stanford University. He won a Nobel Prize in physics and is considered one of the foremost reasons the Silicon Valley became a center of electronics innovation. He began studying human intelligence later in his life, and despite his impressive achievements as a young man, he still considered his later work to be the most important work of his life. Shockey thought aggregate racial disparities in IQ were hereditary and were the reason for racial disparities in economic and educational achievement. He was demonized for this and his support of a voluntary eugenics program, which was not based on race, by the way. But anyways, now that you have a decent understanding of the main tenets of contemporary Afrocentrism, allow me to get into the main point of this video, which is this study that was published just last week, actually, in the academic journal Cell, and subsequently reported on by several different online magazines and media outlets. In the past, there hadn't been a whole lot of genetic research done on sub-Saharan African populations, so scientists always thought that they were the only race without Neanderthal DNA, and it turns out that they were wrong. Africans do carry some ancient Neanderthal admixture, so they was albino cave beasts as well. This again puts the out of Africa theory, at least in its current version, into jeopardy as well. But that's not all. The study not only proved sub-Saharan blacks have Neanderthal DNA, it concluded that there is evidence to suggest the most significant wave of migration out of Africa may have occurred up to 200,000 years ago, while previous estimates had put it around 50 to 70,000 years ago. This means that the first hominids to leave Africa began doing so before or near the same time Homo sapiens were speciating, meaning they may have not even been modern humans yet. The hominids who left were anatomically correct for sure, but they may not have been what we consider modern humans. Once they migrated, they further evolved in the Middle East and Europe and eventually interbred with Neanderthal. So what this essentially means is that the modern humans who eventually became sub-Saharan Africans may have been hominins who evolved into Homo sapiens outside of Africa, interbred with Neanderthal, and then back migrated into Africa about 20,000 years ago, where they interbred with and replaced the remaining hominids still living in Africa, who had been interbreeding with and replacing several less evolved hominin species which were still remaining. This is evidenced by the fact that sub-Saharan Africans carry both Neanderthal DNA and DNA from admixture events with archaic African hominins like Homo erectus. Several so-called ghost populations have contributed DNA to modern sub-Saharan Africans, which were less evolved species which separated from the ancestors of modern humans hundreds of thousands, even millions of years prior. Of the admixture events currently known to geneticists, one species which contributed to the DNA of modern sub-Saharan Africans diverged from the ancestors of modern humans 700,000 years ago. This was likely Homo erectus, or possibly an intermediate species. Another diverged 1.2 million years ago, meaning it was almost surely Homo erectus. And yet another diverged 4.5 million years ago, meaning that it could have not even been far removed from a primate. This means sub-Saharan Africans carry DNA from extremely archaic humans, which likely contributes to their more simian-like features. The more science learns about human genetics, the more evident it becomes that race is very, very real, and there is a reason why we appear and behave differently on average. It also completely destroys Afrocentric narratives about Africans being the original Homo sapiens and Europeans being some inferior genetic abomination. If anything, it is Africans who have admixture which is far more archaic and less evolved than other human races.
A news release by the Australian National University notes, citing new archaeological research, that Homo erectus, an extinct species of primitive humans, went extinct in part because they were lazy. The statement goes on to say, an archaeological excavation of ancient human populations in the Arabian Peninsula during the early Stone Age found that Homo erectus used least effort strategies for tool-making and collecting resources. Researchers say this laziness paired with an inability to adapt to a changing climate likely played a role in the species going extinct.
All this is a product of intermixing with white people from the caves, and now we got hair everywhere. But the original people, we didn't have hair everywhere like this. We were the builders of civilization, but we start mixing with Captain Caveman and them.